This is a passage that talks about Moses and an interaction that he has with his father-in-law. This is what the Bible says. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is it that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning till evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them known the statutes of God and his laws." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What are you doing? What you're doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." When I read this passage, this story in the life of Moses, it comes very close to my own life and experience. I often see myself like Moses, trying to juggle the many responsibilities that I have in life with church and churches and family. You know, I sense sometimes in my life that I am stretched out too thin in a situation that if anything else happens, I'm just going to fall apart. Now, I've been a pastor for over 20 years, and I've never experienced any major case of burnout. But I have been very close to the edge at times, very close to the edge. And I've looked down the precipice, and I've seen that it's not good. Now, by the grace of God, I've always had people in my life, people like Jethro is to Moses here in this moment, that have pointed out the danger, and it has allowed me to take a few steps back. And I've learned a few things along the way to prevent me from completely burning out in the context of ministry in life. Now, as I speak about this last topic of this series to you today, I don't want to speak in a place of strength. This is something that I wrestle with it myself. I actually want to speak to you from a place of weakness because that's a struggle of mine. What are the limits? What are the indications that I'm going too fast, too far, for too long? I want to encourage you today because this is something that not only Pastor Felipe struggles with, but this is something that you and I all together struggle with, especially in living in this culture, in this fast-paced way of life. This is a danger for all of us here today. And my hope is that if you are on the verge of complete burnout, if you are in danger of burnout, that today you would be able to find some hope and that you would be able to place good boundaries in your life. Because, quite frankly, if you burn out, it doesn't just affect you, but it affects everyone around you. It affects your marriage, it affects your family, it affects your coworkers, it affects your church community. So, number one, what is burnout? How do we get there? Number two. And then lastly, how do we beat it? You know, burnout is one of those enemies that if you don't defeat it, if you don't conquer it, it will conquer you. If you don't beat it, it will beat you. So you got to take it really seriously. What is burnout? It's right here, and it's taking place in Moses' life. He is on that precipice that I talked about, and his father-in-law spots it. Now, you know that Moses was the leader that God used to deliver the people from Egypt. God instrumentally selected Moses to be that courageous leader that pleaded with Pharaoh so that the people of God would be delivered. Now, Moses had a family. And his family was neither from Egypt nor from Israel. His family was from the region of Midian. Moses had spent some time previously in Midian after a personal crisis that he went through while he was still living in Egypt. He went out to the desert of Midian, and there he received shelter and refuge by this man by the name of Jethro. The Bible speaks of Jethro as being a pagan priest out in the regions of Midian. And Moses works for Jethro for 40 years while he's in Midian and marries Jethro's daughter. And now, Moses, in this passage where we find ourselves, he has just delivered the people from Egypt. He is out in the desert on the other side of the deliverance. And Jethro, his father-in-law, comes from Midian to meet him, and he brings to Moses his wife and his kids. Because before Moses actually took the people out of Egypt, he left his family with his father-in-law so that they would be kept safe. And so now later, after the deliverance, here comes Jethro. And the text starts in chapter 18 with Jethro coming, obviously, from Midian, bringing Moses' wife and children. And Moses shares with Jethro everything that God had done for them, how God had saved and delivered the people. And then we learn later in the chapter that they sit down and they break bread, they have a nice meal. And then Moses is probably in that meal saying to Jethro, hey, I want you to see something now. Are you ready to see this? You know, Moses is now the leader of this population of about 2 million people, right, that had just come out of Egypt. And I think in his own heart, he's trying to impress his father-in-law, saying, hey, aren't you glad that your daughter marries someone like me? And so he goes with Jethro back into the camp where that huge population of people were at, where Moses was exercising leadership over them. And he gets there. And the text tells us right there in verse 14, that's the first verse that we read, that Jethro is unimpressed with what he sees. And in fact, he's not only unimpressed, but he's actually concerned because he sees a red flag. He sees Moses every day from sunrise to sunset before the people working, judging all the causes that they bring to him. Now, this was a monumental task. Imagine this. Miami-Dade County has probably around like 2 million people. Could you imagine if there was only one judge in Miami-Dade County where everyone would bring all their disputes to, and he had the responsibility to resolve all those disputes? Well, number one, things would not get done, and that person would die, right? There's not enough hours, not enough minutes in the day to take care of responsibilities such as that. And yet that was Moses. But not only that, Moses was not only the only judge, but Moses was the only pastor. What if I was the only pastor here in Miami? God, I would kill myself, right? Doing that. And that's what Moses is doing. And Jethro sees him and he says, that's crazy. In verse 14, his question is, what is it that you're doing? What are you doing? What the heck are you doing? You think this is good? This is actually bad, he says in verse 17. You're going to wear yourself out and you're going to wear the people out if you keep doing this. This is not good. It's going to lead to complete breakdown. He not only sees a red flag, but he also warns him and says, this is pretty serious, which gives us an insight of what burnout is. See, burnout is physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual exhaustion that is caused by doing too much, too fast, for too long. That's what burnout is. And Moses had been doing too much, going too fast, for too long, and now he is in the verge of this precipice of complete breakdown. And by the grace of God, God sends Jethro to warn him of the danger that was right before him. See, when you break down in such a way, it feels devastating. See, specialists will tell you that the experience of burnout feels like as if you are in a constant flight or fight mode. So, for example, let's say you wake up in the morning and there is an alligator in your pool or an alligator in your kitchen. There has been an alligator in people's kitchen here in Miami-Dade, right? So let's say you wake up and you go into your kitchen or even in your backyard and there's an alligator. Your body releases a certain number of hormones to get you to feel afraid and understand the danger that is before you so that you can preserve and protect your life or the lives of the other people that are with you. It puts you on a flight or fight mode, right? Flight or fight. Are you going to fight the alligator? Or are you going to run away from the alligator? You're constantly in that situation when you are experiencing burnout. Not once. See, after you're safe and sound, then things go back to its normal and proper place. But when you are experiencing burnout, that is a constant feeling of yours. And this is something that Moses is constantly going through, because even after this experience, the people are very hard on Moses. He had just delivered them from slavery in Egypt, but they're always complaining, day after day. They're never happy, never satisfied, because when you lead people, that's what it feels like. Number one, you can't please everyone. Even when you're doing your best and you're working your hardest, people are only looking after themselves. And they don't tend to see the big picture. That's what's happening in Moses' life. And therefore, like in Numbers 11, there's another situation. So after this, the people start to complain and say to Moses, hey, Moses, we should have just stayed in Egypt because the food there was actually better. We had meat there. We were slaves, but at least we had steak. And then Moses is so bothered by that, because that begins to build up inside his soul, that he goes to God in verse 14. I'm reading from Numbers 11:14. And Moses says to God, and I'm not able to carry all of this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, God, kill me at once. If I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. He says, just kill me. He's just constantly in that flight or fight mode, because Moses has failed to establish healthy boundaries in his life. And let me tell you something that, you should know, that we are fully integrated beings. Sometimes we tend to understand our human composition as mind, soul, or heart and body. And we tend to address each of those elements of our being separately, failing sometimes to understand that when God created us, he created us as fully integrated beings, which means that whatever affects your soul affects your body. Whatever affects your physical body affects your soul and your heart and your mind. We're all interconnected. All the faculties in us are interconnected. So much so that the psalmist in Psalm 32 said this. He said, when I kept it all inside, meaning his shortcomings, his shame, his sin, he says, my bones turned to powder. He's saying, I'm feeling the physical effects in my body of poor emotional decisions that I have made in my life. I think this name, this thing, burnout, is a perfect way to call this condition. It's a perfect way to identify this condition. Research will tell you that stress causes breakdown at the cell level. Human tissues or body tissues become inflamed when you're experiencing stress, because of this truth that our bodies are fully integrated. Stress and burnout have become leading causes of heart attack and cancer and etc. So I want you to take this very, very seriously. This is not something for us to take mildly. This is something for us to take very, very seriously. Now, how do we get there to begin with? How do we get to this point? How do we get to a point of complete burnout in our lives? And there's 3 reasons of why we get to that place to begin with. Sometimes the explanation that we give is the reason why I'm experiencing burnout, or so-and-so is experiencing burnout, is because we've been doing too much. I have too heavy of a load upon my shoulders. And while that is true, there's something more important happening underneath the surface. And it's what I call a misplaced identity. A misplaced identity. See, Moses was the deliverer of God's people. In fact, the name Moses means Messiah. It's almost the same spelling. Like in Hebrew, you have the M, the S, and the H, like Moshe, Messiah, M-A-S-H as well. See, Hebrew is not a language that has vowels. It only has consonants. And Moses was, in fact, the deliverer of God's people. He had a monumental task in front of him, and he came through with that challenge that God had placed upon his life. And he knew that God was ultimately the one that had delivered the people. That's in fact what he told his father-in-law. When his father-in-law came to meet him, he said, look at what God has done. So he had no problem saying to people and sharing with people all that God had done. He knew that in his head, but in the deepest part of his heart, he acted as he was the glue. He acted as he was the main agent of deliverance. He carried upon himself the messianic complex. And we know that because when Jethro confronts him and says, hey, what are you doing? This is crazy. Look at his response in verse 15. In verse 15, he says, the reason why I'm doing this, it's because the people come to me to inquire about God. See, they need me. They depend on me. How else will they get God if not through me? Moses had this need to be needed. And that's something that many of us have. The approval of others, the applause and the admiration of others, for many of us has become our main source of affirmation, where we draw personal significance and meaning in life. We look at others and we crave their approval because unless they applaud us, unless they approve us, we feel that we are nobodies. And Moses had, at that moment, like many of us, taken away his eyes from God, and he placed his eyes on himself and in the people. Moses had stopped looking at God for his main source of approval, and he was looking now at the people as his main source of approval. And that explains why he's constantly getting angry. Because whenever he does not get that approval, whenever he gets the criticism of the people, whenever the people complain, it's not just something that he should not be taking personal, because the people are actually uncomfortable in that desert situation, but he takes it personal because it hurts him that the people in which he is looking for approval are not giving him or now giving him reproach. He has misplaced his identity. He is not drawing his identity from God. He is drawing his identity from people. That is one way. That's what happens underneath the surface in all of our lives. That leads us to do too much, too fast, for too long, and it ultimately leads us to burn out and break down. Secondly, because of that, we tend to overfunction. What is to overfunction? And I learned this in Peter Scazzero's book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. He says in that book that overfunctioning is doing for others what they can do for themselves. That's what overfunctioning is. Doing for others what they can do for themselves. Jethro pointed that out to Moses. He said to Moses, Moses, you are sitting alone. There are perfectly capable people in your community that can do what you're doing, that can help you to do what you're doing, that can come alongside you, that can share the burden with you. Like when you do the work that they could be doing, like you're hurting yourselves and you're hurting them as well because you are keeping them from living up to their potential. You are keeping them from stepping up into their responsibilities. See, because whenever somebody overfunctions, they are enabling somebody to underfunction. Let's say your spouse is overfunctioning at work. They can't say no. They always stay an hour later. Always compromise the weekends with work. Because they are over-functioning at work, they are under-functioning at home. And guess what you do? You enable them because you begin to over-function at home. Now you're the only one doing the laundry and washing the dishes and looking after the children, and you're feeling all of a sudden that you are a single spouse. Am I telling the truth here? When somebody overfunction, they enable others to underfunction. And so what you think you're doing is helping, but you're actually enabling. You're making the situation worse. What would it look like for you to say, hey, I am not cooking the meals every night. I don't care. You spend more money, you come home and you cook, but I'm not cooking every night. I'm cooking 2 nights. That's it. Oh my gosh, you're not giving me the support that I need. No, I'm not enabling you to overfunction, which will in the end lead to your breakdown and to my breakdown and to our family's breakdown. You see what I'm saying? Overfunctioning, doing for others what they can do for themselves. That is unhealthy. That is not sustainable. That is an endless cycle that will lead to your breakdown and to your beloved's breakdown and to your family's breakdown. So we end up overfunctioning. Ask this question, what am I doing for people that they can be doing for themselves? Thirdly, output without input. You know, part of the reason why Jethro is concerned with Moses is because there's a lot of output in Moses' life with very little input. Not only is Moses standing alone, which means there's no one to come alongside him, there's no one to keep him accountable, there's no one to challenge him. He is far from others, but he is also far from God. He is not receiving the emotional nourishment that he needs from relationships with people and with God, and he is putting a lot of output. And that's what leads to breakdown. Parker Palmer, who is a Quaker writer and thinker, defines burnout this way. Though usually regarded as the result of trying to give too much, burnout, in my experience, results from trying to give what I do not possess. Many of us are trying to give wisdom to people which we do not possess. And that's what's happening here in Moses. Isn't that funny? That he is standing before the people's judge every day from sunrise to sunset, resolving their disputes, right? Judging the people. Yet he has no wisdom. He's dispensing wisdom to people, but he lacks wisdom in his own life. It takes his father-in-law to come from a foreign land to see that and say, that is not wise what you're doing. In verse 17, he says, what you're doing is not good. So he is completely unwise about his own life, and yet he is giving wisdom to people. He is giving that which he does not possess. You know, many of us sometimes are trying to give God to people, a God that we don't spend time with. Like, as if for God, the most important thing was doing things for him. Let me tell you something. The most important thing for God is not that you do things for him, is that you spend time with him. And you cannot give for God and to others if you're not receiving from him. And that's what's happening here in Moses' life. And that is a big, big issue. He is giving out of that which he does not possess. If you start giving out of that which you do not possess, you will experience burnout. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux used to say this, that there's some people that are pipes and others that are bowls. What's a pipe? A pipe is whatever comes in goes out, right? There are people like that. And then there are people that are bowls that give out of abundance, that give out of overflow. We must be bowls and not pipes. So how do you fill yourself up? And at the same time, how do you beat and defeat burnout so that you can give out of overflow to others? 2 ways here. There's a very practical way and a more in-depth way. One is about changing our behavior, and the other one is about doing a soul search, an inward heart inventory. How do we prevent? How do we keep ourselves? How do we fight burnout? 1, drop it and share it. That's what Jethro says to Moses. Moses, you got to drop what you're doing, and you got to share it with others. In other words, you must learn how to say no and ask for help. That's simple, right? Say more no's and ask more for help. Now, as simple as that is, or as simple as that sounds, it is something unbelievably hard for us to do. You know why? Because We need, again, remember, we need the approval and the affirmation of others. That's how we feel that we have worth and that our lives have significance and that our lives have meaning. And so we can't say no because I am looking for the affirmation of my boss, of my peers, of my children, of my spouse. So I can't say no. And the reason why we can't say help is because we're not humble enough to receive. We have this deep-seated belief inside our hearts that everything depends on us and that we can do it on our own. So Moses says, drop it. So Jethro says, drop it and share it with others. And this is good advice. This is filled with wisdom, words filled with wisdom. But you know what's better? Like if you keep reading the Bible, there is a better piece of advice. In fact, it's actually good news later in the Bible. Jesus comes to us, intervenes into our lives. Much like Jethro has this intervention in Moses' life, in the person of Jesus, God intervenes. And he says something better than what Jethro says to Moses. Jethro says to Moses, drop it and share it with others. Jesus says, drop it and place it on me. Take your burden and put on my shoulders, and I will give you rest. And Matthew 11, verses 28 and 30, Jesus says this, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. See, Jesus is standing before you today, and he is looking at all the unsustainable ways in which you are living your life right now. He is observing all the lack of wisdom and the misplaced identity that he sees in your life. He sees you over-functioning and empowering people to under-function. He sees that there is more output in your life than input. And he's saying to you with all his mercy and all his grace, he is not coming to you with judgment, but he is coming to you with mercy and grace. And he's saying, you can drop all of this on my shoulders and I'll carry it for you. Will you drop your load on Jesus' shoulders? See, you have to learn how to welcome his grace into your life. Why is it that we're resisting Jesus' offer of grace, his mercy, and his compassion towards us? Because we're prideful. But if you learn how to welcome Jesus' grace, like grace will permeate your life and it will give you the wisdom that you need because you know all of that you already have received in him. It will allow you to ask 4 questions and to do 4 things, right? To do 4 things and to ask 4 questions. Number 1, it would allow you to revisit your motivation. Revisit your motivation. At some point, you need to stop and you need to ask yourself. I've learned to do that on a constant basis in my own life. Ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I doing so much? Is it to get love in the end so that people will applaud and respect me so that I get love? Or to get love from God and to get my prayers answered? Or is it because I'm already fulfilled and filled, because I've already have received the grace and the love that I've needed in him, and I work out of this overflow? Why is it that you're doing what you're doing? What is your motivation? Revisit your motivations today. Secondly, readjust your expectations. You must readjust your expectations in regards to God, in regards to yourself. Ask the question, does God really want me to do all of this and to be perfect in the execution of it? Does God require perfection for me? He does not. Adjust your expectations in relation to God. Can God do much with little? Because we are always feeling like we're not doing enough. Can God multiply that which I do? Readjust your expectations with God. The answer obviously is yes. Thirdly, relinquish control. Relinquish control. See, the reason why you're experiencing burnout and stress is because you're sitting in someone else's chair. You're inadequate. You're disqualified to do that job. If someone is in need of a stomach surgery and I come to you and I say, here are the instruments for you to perform that surgery, go perform that surgery, how would that make you feel? Would you feel nervous? Would you be stressed out? Because you're inadequate, right, to perform that procedure. The reason why you are feeling stressed out and anxious is because you are disqualified. You are doing someone else's job. By the way, that's God's job. Let him do his job. And that is actually really healthy, especially when there are setbacks in life. You say, yeah, it was not my control. God was the one in control. And then lastly, remember God's provision. Remember God's provision. Learn that everything that God has given you, not just your work, not just your family, is a gift from him. People, relationships are gifts from God. Food is a gift from God. Leisure is a gift from God. By the way, how many of you guys have hobbies? You should have hobbies. That's the reason why I do jujitsu, to endure the fight of ministry. That's my hobby. Well, 3 times a week, I train jujitsu during lunchtime. It's my hobby. So what that means is see everything as a gift and live a balanced life, because that's healthy. Don't take yourself too seriously, okay? And then ultimately, remember that salvation is a gift from God as well. See, Jesus did all the work that was necessary for us to gain a sense of self-worth. Jesus did all that was necessary so that we would receive the approval and the love of the only person in the universe that truly matters, the love and the approval of God. When I accept that which Jesus Christ has done for me on the cross, the same approval that Jesus has of the Father, I also receive as mine. See, on the cross, as Jesus was dying, his last words were, "It is finished." And when you take that deeply into your heart, that Jesus on the cross is saying to you and I, "It is finished," you and I can rest. And we can defeat burnout. So will you rest in him today? Let's pray. Father, give us the power and the faith that it takes so that we may find rest in you. Father, we confess that we are burdened. Father, we confess that we are heavy laden. And many times, Father, we resist the call to ask for help, to go to you, and to find grace and mercy in you. And so, Father, I pray today that you allow us to see ourselves in this helpless state. You would remove the blind spots in our lives so that we can run to Jesus and we can give his burden, our burdens up to him. Father, may we experience freedom today. May our souls be nurtured and replenished. In Jesus' name.